A heavy silence fell over courtroom 302 of the Atlanta Superior Court on a crisp autumn morning. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the polished wooden benches where spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. It was 9 o'clock a.m., and the high-profile case of the state versus James Morrison was about to begin its sentencing phase. James Morrison, a 45-year-old construction contractor with graying temples and cold blue eyes, sat at the defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white with tension. Next to him, the bailiff's voice rang out clear and firm. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson presiding." The rustle of movement filled the courtroom as everyone stood. Judge Thompson entered with measured steps, his black robe flowing behind him as he made his way to the bench. At 58 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from spending 25 years serving justice in this very courthouse. What made this case particularly noteworthy wasn't just Morrison's crimes, though they were serious enough. It was the history behind them. Over the past decade, Morrison had built a reputation in Atlanta's suburban communities for his racially motivated offenses. His record included vandalism of minority-owned businesses, assault charges, and numerous documented incidents of racial harassment. The local media had been following the case closely since Morrison's arrest 6 months ago. Today, reporters filled the back row of the courtroom, their pens poised over notepads. Among them sat Sarah Chen from the Atlanta Daily News, who had covered every day of the trial. She noted how Morrison's demeanor had changed since his conviction last week. The swagger was gone, replaced by a barely contained anger that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. Judge Thompson settled into his chair and adjusted his reading glasses, taking a moment to survey the courtroom. His reputation preceded him. Known for being tough but fair, he had earned the respect of both prosecutors and defense attorneys throughout his career. His journey to the bench hadn't been easy. He was among the first African-American judges appointed to the Superior Court in this district, breaking barriers and facing challenges with unwavering professionalism. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Martinez, stood ready with her files. Her dark suit and confident posture reflected her decade of experience handling difficult cases. She had successfully convinced the jury of Morrison's guilt in what she called one of the most blatant cases of hate-motivated crime she'd ever prosecuted. As Judge Thompson began reviewing the case files, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The victims of Morrison's crimes sat in the front row, 3 families whose businesses had been targeted, vandalized, and nearly destroyed. Among them was Michael Washington, owner of a successful local restaurant, who had testified about finding his establishment covered in racist graffiti and the windows shattered one morning. The court clerk, Mrs. Patricia Dawson, who had worked with Judge Thompson for 15 years, noticed something different in Morrison's behavior. Throughout the trial, he had maintained a facade of indifference, but today there was a visible agitation in his movements, a darkness in his expression that made her uneasy. Detective James Rodriguez, who had led the investigation, sat behind the prosecutor's table. He had spent months building an airtight case against Morrison, collecting security footage, witness statements, and digital evidence that proved the systematic nature of his attacks on minority-owned businesses. The detective's careful work had been crucial in securing the conviction. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, creating patterns on the marble floor. Outside, the sounds of Atlanta's busy downtown were muffled, creating an atmosphere of isolation within the courtroom. The American flag stood quietly in the corner, its presence a reminder of the principles of justice that would guide the proceedings. As Judge Thompson prepared to begin the sentencing hearing, no one in the courtroom could have predicted the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The air was charged with anticipation, and even the most experienced court staff could sense that this would not be an ordinary sentencing. Morrison's right leg bounced nervously under the table, his attorney placed a cautioning hand on his arm, and the spectators leaned forward slightly in their seats. The stage was set for what would become one of the most memorable cases in Atlanta's recent judicial history. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, adjusted his microphone, and prepared to address the court, unaware that in just a few moments, his judicial wisdom and personal character would be put to an extraordinary test. Judge Thompson looked directly at Morrison and spoke in his characteristically measured tone. "Mr. Morrison, before we proceed with sentencing, you have the right to make a statement. Would you like to address the court?" What happened next would be remembered by everyone present in courtroom 302 for years to come. Morrison stood up abruptly, shrugging off his attorney's restraining hand. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and the veins in his neck became visible as he began what would become an infamous courtroom tirade. "I don't recognize your authority to sentence me," Morrison spat out, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I demand a different judge. How can I expect fair treatment from—" He then launched into a stream of racial slurs and accusations so vile that several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Benjamin Hayes, Morrison's defense attorney, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to consult with my client." Sweat had broken out on his forehead as he attempted to control the situation, but Morrison wasn't finished. "You've probably been waiting for this moment, haven't you?" Morrison continued, ignoring his lawyer completely. "To get back at white folks? I've seen how you people work the system." His voice had risen to a shout, echoing off the courtroom walls. The bailiff took a step forward, ready to intervene, but Judge Thompson raised his hand slightly, signaling him to wait. The judge's expression remained unchanged, his dark eyes steady as they watched Morrison's display of hatred unfold. In the gallery, Sarah Chen's pen flew across her notepad, capturing every word of the outburst. The victims' families sat rigid with shock, while court staff exchanged worried glances. Detective Rodriguez unconsciously touched the weapon at his hip, though Morrison remained behind the defense table. Patricia Dawson, the court clerk, had seen many dramatic moments in this courtroom, but nothing quite like this. She noticed how Judge Thompson's hands remained perfectly still on the bench, showing no sign of the tension that must have been coursing through him. Morrison's rant continued for several minutes, becoming increasingly personal and offensive. He brought up old racist stereotypes, made wild accusations about reverse discrimination, and demanded a white judge who would understand his situation. The words seemed to poison the very air in the courtroom. Rachel Martinez, the prosecutor, sat perfectly still, her face a mask of professional composure, though her knuckles had turned white from gripping her pen. She had dealt with racist defendants before, but Morrison's performance was reaching new levels of hostility. Benjamin Hayes had given up trying to silence his client and now sat with his head in his hands, his career likely flashing before his eyes. The code of professional conduct required him to represent his client zealously, but nothing in law school had prepared him for this moment. The security officers at the courtroom doors had moved closer to the center of the room, their bodies tense and ready. The atmosphere was so charged that even the slightest spark could set off something dangerous. Michael Washington, watching from the front row, felt a complex mix of emotions. As one of Morrison's victims, he had expected to feel satisfaction at the sentencing, but this display of raw hatred made him feel only sadness for the depth of Morrison's prejudice. Throughout the tirade, Judge Thompson remained still, his face betraying no emotion. He had faced racism before, as a law student, as a young attorney, and even as a judge, but never so blatantly in his own courtroom. The eyes of every person in the room were now fixed on him, waiting to see how he would respond. Morrison finally ran out of steam, his chest heaving as he finished his vitriolic speech. A thick silence fell over the courtroom, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pregnant with possibility and danger, the kind of silence that often precedes either disaster or something extraordinary. Judge Thompson slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the bench before him. The small sound seemed magnified in the tense quiet. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced, and looked directly at Morrison. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of this case, but would become a testament to the power of judicial temperament and human dignity in the face of hatred. As Judge Thompson prepared to speak, no one could have predicted the remarkable turn the proceedings were about to take. Judge Thompson allowed the silence to linger for a full 30 seconds after Morrison's outburst. The quiet was deafening, making even the soft hum of the courtroom's air conditioning system seem loud. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "Mr. Morrison," he began, "I've taken careful note of your concerns." He opened a thick folder before him, the sound of rustling papers the only noise in the otherwise silent courtroom. "Before I address your comments, I believe it's important to review the facts that brought us here today." The judge began methodically reading from Morrison's criminal record, his voice steady and professional. On June 15, 2015, you were first arrested for vandalizing Mr. Washington's restaurant with racist graffiti. You received probation. You looked up briefly. That was your first documented hate crime. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Judge Thompson continued through the list. August 2017, assault against Dr. James Chen outside his medical practice. March 2019, threatening letters sent to the Rodriguez family's grocery store. December 2020, attempted arson at the Williams Auto Repair Shop. With each incident, Judge Thompson provided precise details, dates, times, witness statements, and police reports. He described how Morrison's crimes had escalated over time, becoming more violent and more targeted. The judge's recitation painted a clear picture of a decade-long campaign of hatred and intimidation. Rachel Martinez watched with growing admiration as Judge Thompson transformed Morrison's own criminal history into a powerful response to his racist tirade. The victims in the gallery sat straighter as their stories were acknowledged and validated through the official record. Mr. Morrison, Judge Thompson continued, looking up from the documents, your actions show a clear pattern. But what's most striking is not just the crimes themselves, but your consistent attempt to justify them through racial bias. He pulled out another document. In your 2017 arrest interview, you told Detective Sanders, and I quote, "These people don't belong here." In 2019, you told Officer Johnson that you were protecting the neighborhood. Last year, during this very trial, you testified that you were maintaining community standards. Benjamin Hayes, Morrison's attorney, had recovered enough to attempt damage control. Your Honor, if I may. Judge Thompson raised his hand slightly. Counsel, I understand your position, but I believe it's important that we address these matters directly. He turned his attention back to Morrison, who had begun to look less defiant and more uncertain. What's particularly notable, the judge continued, is that each of your victims was a successful business owner or professional who contributed significantly to this community. He picked up another file. Mr. Washington's restaurant employs 27 people. Dr. Chen's practice serves over 2,000 patients. The Rodriguez grocery store has been a neighborhood fixture for 3 generations. The judge paused to take a sip of water, a small action somehow making the moment more powerful. These are the facts of your case, Mr. Morrison, not assumptions, not prejudices, but documented evidence of your actions and their impact on real people. Patricia Dawson, who had served as court clerk for countless cases, realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Judge Thompson wasn't just reciting a criminal record. He was systematically dismantling Morrison's worldview with nothing but the truth. Sarah Chen's pen had stopped moving across her notepad as she, like everyone else in the courtroom, was completely absorbed in the judge's methodical presentation. Detective Rodriguez nodded slightly with each fact presented, remembering the long hours spent building this case. Judge Thompson closed the last file and removed his reading glasses. Mr. Morrison, you've expressed concern about receiving fair treatment in this court. I just reviewed your extensive criminal history, documented by officers of multiple races, verified by witnesses of various backgrounds, and proven beyond reasonable doubt to a jury of your peers. He leaned forward slightly. The question isn't whether you can receive fair treatment from a black judge. The question is whether you've dealt fairly with others throughout your life. Based on the evidence before this court, the answer is clear. The courtroom remained completely silent, the impact of Judge Thompson's words hanging in the air. Morrison's earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by what appeared to be genuine discomfort as he was forced to confront the detailed record of his actions. What would happen next would surprise everyone in the courtroom as Judge Thompson prepared to share something personal that would change the entire dynamic of the proceedings. Judge Thompson removed his black robe, a gesture that sent a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Placing it carefully on his chair, he revealed a crisp white shirt and tie underneath. This simple action transformed the atmosphere. Suddenly, he wasn't just speaking as a judge, but as a human being. Mr. Morrison, he began, stepping down from the bench to stand closer to the courtroom floor, I'd like to tell you a story about my father, William Thompson. His voice carried a warmth that hadn't been present during his earlier recitation of facts. In 1963, my father opened a small auto repair shop in South Atlanta. He was the first black business owner in that neighborhood. Judge Thompson paused, allowing the parallel with Morrison's crimes against minority business owners to sink in. He faced exactly the kind of treatment you've been dealing out to others. The courtroom was completely still as he continued. One morning, he arrived to find his windows broken and racist graffiti on the walls, much like what you did to Mr. Washington's restaurant. The next week, someone slashed his tires. The week after that, people started threatening his customers. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to meet the judge's gaze. The victims in the gallery listened intently, seeing their own experiences reflected in this personal history. But here's what my father did, Judge Thompson continued, now moving to stand near the center of the courtroom. Every morning, he opened his shop at exactly 7 a.m. He fixed cars for anyone who came in, including the people he suspected of vandalizing his business. He did his work with excellence, charged fair prices, and treated everyone with respect. Sarah Chen's pen flew across her notepad, capturing every word. This was no longer just a sentencing hearing. It was becoming a powerful lesson in dignity and resilience. One day, the judge continued, a man came in with a broken radiator. This same man had been seen painting slurs on our garage doors just days before. My father knew it. I knew it. Everyone knew it. He paused, allowing the tension to build. My father not only fixed his car but stayed late to make sure it was done right. Benjamin Hayes, Morrison's attorney, sat transfixed. In all his years of practice, he had never seen a judge share something so personal during sentencing. Patricia Dawson, the court clerk, quietly wiped a tear from her eye. When I asked him why, Judge Thompson said, his voice growing softer, my father told me something I've never forgotten. He said, son, hatred is a heavy burden to carry. I choose not to pick it up. The words seemed to echo in the quiet courtroom. That man with the radiator, he became one of our most loyal customers. Later, when others tried to cause trouble, he was the one who stood up for us. His children played with me after school. His wife brought us pies at Christmas. Judge Thompson smiled slightly at the memory. My father didn't respond to prejudice with bitterness or revenge. Instead, he chose to demonstrate excellence. He chose to show through his actions that the color of his skin had nothing to do with the quality of his character or his work. Morrison's face had lost its angry red color, replaced by something that looked like confusion, or perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. Rachel Martinez watched him carefully, noting how his shoulders had begun to slump. Mr. Morrison, Judge Thompson continued, now walking back toward the bench, my father faced the same kind of hatred you've been spreading, but he chose a different path. He showed me that true strength isn't in terrorizing others or claiming superiority. It's in maintaining your dignity and doing what's right, even when faced with injustice. The judge picked up his robe but didn't put it back on yet. I became a judge not despite the challenges my father faced, but because of how he faced them. He taught me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about making things right. The silence in the courtroom was different now, no longer tense, but contemplative. Even the most hardened court officers seemed moved by the personal narrative. As Judge Thompson prepared to don his robe again and return to his official role, everyone in the courtroom sensed that something profound had shifted. The next few moments would reveal exactly how this personal story would influence his handling of Morrison's case, and no one, not even the most experienced court veterans, could predict what would happen next. Judge Thompson put his robe back on with deliberate care, each movement precise and measured. The black fabric settled on his shoulders like a symbol of the weight of the decision he was about to make. He returned to the bench, adjusted his microphone, and looked directly at Morrison. After careful consideration of everything that has transpired in this courtroom today, he began, his voice carrying the full authority of his position once again, I have reached a decision that may surprise everyone present. The tension in the courtroom mounted. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, and Benjamin Hayes nervously straightened his tie, preparing for whatever might come next. I am recusing myself from this case, Judge Thompson announced. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by confused murmurs. Morrison's head snapped up in surprise, while Rachel Martinez's mouth fell open slightly. However, the judge continued, raising his hand for silence. I want to be absolutely clear about the reasons for this decision. I am not stepping down because of Mr. Morrison's demands or his inflammatory statements. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. I am recusing myself because the integrity of our justice system is paramount. while I am fully capable of rendering an impartial judgment, as my record of 25 years on this bench demonstrates, I will not allow even the appearance of bias to potentially undermine the finality of this sentence on appeal. Patricia Dawson began typing furiously, recording every word for the official court record. She had seen many recusals in her time, but never one handled quite like this. Mr. Morrison, Judge Thompson continued, you should understand that this decision is not a victory for prejudice. Rather, it is a demonstration of how justice operates when guided by principle rather than passion. Detective Rodriguez watched from his seat as Morrison's expression shifted from initial triumph to growing uncertainty. The defendant was clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. The case will be reassigned to another judge, Judge Thompson explained, shuffling through some papers on his bench. They will review the same evidence, the same testimony, and the same legal precedents that I would have considered. The facts of your crimes remain unchanged. Sarah Chen's pen raced across her notepad as she captured the historic moment. This would make headlines not just in Atlanta but across the country, though perhaps not for the reasons Morrison had hoped. Before I formally stepped down, Judge Thompson said, his voice taking on a more personal tone again, I want to address everyone in this courtroom. He looked around, making eye contact with the victims, the court staff, and even Morrison's supporters in the gallery. What we witnessed today is not just about one case or one defendant. It's about the fundamental principles that make our justice system work. When we allow prejudice to dictate our actions, we all lose. When we stand firm on principles, we all win, even those who might not recognize it at the moment. Benjamin Hayes stood up, looking somewhat relieved but also chastened. Your Honor, on behalf of my client, I would like to apologize for. Judge Thompson raised his hand. Counsel, save your statements for the new judge. They will need to hear them more than I do. The judge then began writing on his official letterhead, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the hushed courtroom. I am entering my recusal into the record, along with a detailed explanation of the circumstances. The case will be randomly reassigned according to court procedures. Morrison sat in stunned silence, his earlier bravado completely deflated. He had gotten what he demanded, but somehow it felt like a hollow victory. Court Officer Williams, Judge Thompson called, please escort Mr. Morrison back to holding while we process the paperwork for reassignment. He looked at his watch. The clerk's office will notify all parties of their new court date by tomorrow morning. As the proceedings wound down, there was a palpable sense that they had all witnessed something extraordinary. A moment where justice had been served not through force or punishment, but through unwavering adherence to principle. Before stepping down from the bench one final time, Judge Thompson looked directly at Morrison and delivered words that would be quoted in law schools for years to come. Sometimes, Mr. Morrison, the greatest power lies not in what we do, but in how we choose to do it. The next phase of this remarkable case would soon begin under a new judge, but the impact of Judge Thompson's decision would resonate far beyond the walls of courtroom 302. Before officially concluding the session, Judge Thompson removed his reading glasses one final time and surveyed the courtroom. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation as everyone sensed he had one last thing to say. Before we adjourn, he began, his voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention, I'd like to share some thoughts about justice and what it means in a society that still struggles with prejudice. Morrison, who had been preparing to stand for the court officers, slowly sank back into his chair. The reporters in the gallery gripped their pens tighter, knowing they were about to witness something significant. The scales of justice are blind, Judge Thompson continued, not because they ignore our differences, but because they weigh our actions based on their merit, not on who we are or what we look like. This is not a modern concept, it's as old as justice itself. Rachel Martinez noticed how even the most seasoned court staff had stopped their usual activities to listen. The judge's words seemed to fill every corner of the room. When I look out at this courtroom today, I see people of every background, attorneys, officers, citizens, journalists. Each of you plays a vital role in ensuring justice works as it should. Our system isn't perfect, but its strength lies in our constant effort to make it better, fairer, more equitable. The victims' families in the front row sat straighter, feeling their dignity restored by these words. Michael Washington, still bearing the financial scars of Morrison's vandalism, nodded slowly in agreement. Mr. Morrison believes he cannot receive justice from a black judge, Thompson continued, his voice steady and clear. But what he fails to understand is that justice doesn't flow from the judge. It flows from the law, from evidence, from truth. The color of my robe matters far more than the color of my skin. Spontaneous applause broke out in the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's raised hand. But the impact of the words lingered in the air. I've spent 25 years on this bench, the judge went on, and I've sentenced people of every race, religion, and background. Some of my toughest sentences went to defendants who looked like me, and some of my most lenient to those who didn't. Because justice demands that we look deeper than surface appearances. Benjamin Hayes, Morrison's attorney, had stopped taking notes and was simply listening, his expression showing a mix of respect and reflection. Even his client seemed unable to look away. The law is not a weapon to be wielded against those we dislike or fear. It's a shield that protects all of us equally. When we forget that, we risk everything our system stands for. Judge Thompson stood, adding gravity to his final words. In recusing myself today, I'm not bowing to prejudice. I'm demonstrating that our system is strong enough to withstand challenges, wise enough to adapt when necessary, and fair enough to protect even those who doubt its fairness. The entire courtroom rose in unison, not waiting for the bailiff's command. The standing ovation that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt, starting with the court staff and quickly spreading throughout the room. Even some of Morrison's supporters found themselves standing, moved by the dignity and wisdom they had witnessed. Patricia Dawson, wiping tears from her eyes, noticed that the court reporter had stopped typing and was also standing, applauding with everyone else. This breach of protocol went unremarked. Some moments transcend regular rules. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, during which Judge Thompson stood quietly, accepting this recognition with the same grace he had shown throughout the proceedings. When he finally raised his hand for silence, the room immediately stilled. Court is adjourned, he said simply, gathering his papers. Mr. Morrison, you will be notified of your new court date. Everyone else, thank you for your attention today. As Judge Thompson prepared to leave the bench, Benjamin Hayes surprised everyone by speaking up. Your Honor, he said, his voice thick with emotion, on behalf of the legal profession, thank you for this lesson in true justice. The judge nodded once in acknowledgement and made his way to his chambers. As he passed through the door, Sarah Chen from the Atlanta Daily News was already typing the headline on her laptop. Judge's response to racism becomes lesson in justice. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact of what had transpired would echo far beyond that day. Law schools would soon add this case to their ethics curriculum, and Judge Thompson's words would be quoted in legal textbooks for years to come. As the last people filed out, even the most cynical observers had to admit they had witnessed something remarkable, a moment when justice prevailed not through force, but through wisdom and dignity. 2 weeks later, Courtroom 405 buzzed with anticipation as Judge Sarah Chen prepared to deliver Morrison's sentence. The case had been randomly reassigned to her, an Asian American judge with 15 years of experience on the bench. The same players were present, though the atmosphere was markedly different from the previous hearing. Morrison sat subdued beside his attorney, the fire of his previous defiance extinguished. News of Judge Thompson's handling of his outburst had spread. Judge Chen, known for her precise legal mind and no-nonsense approach, had thoroughly reviewed the case files. She'd spent hours studying the evidence, witness testimonies, and the detailed notes left by Judge Thompson. Her reputation for fairness and strict adherence to the law preceded her. "Will the defendant please rise?" she commanded, her voice clear and authoritative. Morrison stood slowly, his shoulders hunched. Benjamin Hayes rose beside him, his demeanor professional but notably more reserved than in previous appearances. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Chen began, adjusting her glasses, "I have reviewed every aspect of this case with great care. The evidence presents a clear pattern of premeditated hate crimes spanning multiple years, targeting various minority-owned businesses in our community." Rachel Martinez watched intently from the prosecutor's table. She had presented the same sentencing recommendations to Judge Chen that she had prepared for Judge Thompson, based strictly on state guidelines and the severity of the crimes. "The prosecution has recommended the maximum sentence allowed under state law," Judge Chen continued. After careful consideration of all factors, including the systematic nature of your crimes, their impact on the community, and your lack of remorse during trial, I find their recommendation appropriate." Michael Washington and the other victims leaned forward in their seats. This was the moment they had been waiting for, justice for years of harassment and fear. James Morrison, Judge Chen declared, "This court sentences you to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Additionally, you will pay restitution to all affected businesses, totaling $427,000. The sentence was exactly what Judge Thompson had planned to deliver, though Morrison had no way of knowing this. The justice system had worked exactly as it should, unaffected by the defendant's attempts to manipulate it through racial bias. Furthermore, Judge Chen added, "You will be required to complete 2,000 hours of community service upon release, specifically working with minority-owned businesses affected by hate crimes. You will also attend mandatory diversity and sensitivity training throughout your incarceration." Sarah Chen, still covering the case for the Atlanta Daily News, noted how the sentence perfectly balanced punishment with rehabilitation. It was a textbook example of justice being served without vengeance. Morrison's face had gone pale. Perhaps he was realizing that his racist outburst and demands for a different judge had changed nothing about the legal consequences of his actions. If anything, his behavior had only served to highlight the fairness of the system he had tried to undermine. "Your Honor," Benjamin Hayes stood to speak, "we accept the court's decision and waive our right to immediate appeal." This announcement caused a slight stir in the courtroom. Morrison had finally accepted the inevitability of facing consequences for his actions. Judge Chen nodded in acknowledgement. "Mr. Morrison, you have the right to appeal this sentence within 30 days. However, given your attorney's statement, I understand you are declining to do so at this time. Is that correct?" Morrison's "Yes, Your Honor" was barely audible, but it was recorded for the court transcript. The fight had gone out of him entirely. As court officers approached to take Morrison into custody, Judge Chen had one final statement. "Let the record show that this sentence is consistent with state guidelines for hate crimes of this nature. Justice has been served today, not because of who sits on this bench, but because of the evidence, the law, and the principles of our justice system." The victims and their families exchanged relieved glances. Detective Rodriguez, sitting in the back of the courtroom, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The system had worked exactly as it should. As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, Patricia Dawson, who had transferred to Judge Chen's courtroom to see the case through, couldn't help but think about Judge Thompson's words from 2 weeks ago. Today had proven them true. Justice truly was blind to everything except the facts and the law. The case of the state versus James Morrison was over, but its impact on the legal community and the broader conversation about race and justice was just beginning. 6 months after Morrison's sentencing, the case had become a powerful teaching moment in legal circles across the country. The Atlanta Bar Association organized a special symposium titled "Justice Beyond Bias," where Judge Thompson's handling of the case was studied as a masterclass in judicial temperament. "What we witnessed in that courtroom was extraordinary," declared Professor Maria Rodriguez from Harvard Law School, addressing the packed audience. The case had already been added to ethics curricula in several law schools. First-year law students were now studying the transcript of Judge Thompson's recusal speech as an example of how principles could triumph over prejudice in the legal system. Benjamin Hayes, Morrison's former attorney, had undergone his own transformation. He now conducted workshops for other defense attorneys on handling clients with biased views, using his experience from the Morrison case as a cautionary tale. "I learned more about legal ethics in those few minutes of Judge Thompson's speech than I had in years of practice," Hayes admitted to a group of young lawyers. "It changed how I approach every case now." The impact extended beyond the legal community. Local business organizations had created a support network for minority-owned businesses affected by hate crimes, inspired by the resilience shown by Morrison's victims. Michael Washington's restaurant had become a symbol of community solidarity, with business better than ever. Rachel Martinez, the prosecutor, had been promoted to head the hate crimes division of the district attorney's office. She often cited the case when training new prosecutors. "The key lesson," she would say, "is that justice doesn't need anger to be effective. It needs principle and consistency." In the state prison, where Morrison served his sentence, changes were also evident. The facility had implemented a new rehabilitation program focusing on addressing racial bias, using the case as a starting point for discussions about prejudice and its consequences. Judge Chen had received numerous requests to speak about her role in the case. She always emphasized the same point. The beauty of our justice system is that it worked exactly as it should. Different judges, same evidence, same outcome. The court clerk, Patricia Dawson, had compiled all the documents from the case into a special archive, which was now used for training new court staff. We call it the Dignity Protocol, she explained to visitors. It shows how to maintain professionalism even in the most challenging situations. Sarah Chen's coverage of the case had won her a prestigious journalism award. Her series of articles, titled When Justice Speaks, had captured not just the legal proceedings but the human story behind them. She was now working on a book about the case's broader implications for American justice. Detective Rodriguez had created a new training module for the police department, using the case to demonstrate the importance of thorough, unbiased investigation. Solid evidence speaks louder than any prejudice became his motto for new recruits. Perhaps most significantly, Judge Thompson's handling of the case had inspired a movement within the judicial community. Judges across the country were studying his approach, learning how to address bias in their courtrooms without compromising their authority or the dignity of their position. The victims' families had found healing in unexpected ways. They formed a support group for others who had experienced hate crimes, sharing their story of how justice had prevailed not through vengeance, but through unwavering adherence to principle. 1 year after the sentencing, the Atlanta Legal Review published a comprehensive analysis of the case. Their conclusion was simple but powerful. The Morrison case demonstrates that true justice doesn't need to fight prejudice, it simply needs to outlast it. As for Morrison himself, reports from the prison indicated that he had begun participating in the rehabilitation programs. Whether this represented genuine change or merely compliance with his sentence requirements remained to be seen, but the system had done its part in providing both punishment and opportunity for reform. Judge Thompson continued his work on the bench, approaching each case with the same principled dedication that had made the Morrison case so memorable. When asked about it, he would simply say, "Justice doesn't need defenders, it needs practitioners." The case had become more than just a legal proceeding. It was now a testament to the resilience of the justice system and a reminder that principles, when firmly held, could overcome even the most deeply rooted prejudices. In law schools, courtrooms, and community discussions across the country, the lesson continued to resonate. Justice, when properly served, knows no color.